My sister left her 3 kids at my house with a note saying, "You wanted a family so badly, here you go," then disappeared on a 6-week vacation. I cared for them without calling once. When she finally came back and demanded her children, the oldest stepped between us and asked, "Are you going to tell her, or should I?" Emmett's bathwater had gone lukewarm by the time I noticed the marks on his upper arm, 4 small ovals, evenly spaced, exactly the width of an adult hand gripping too hard, already yellowing at the edges like they were healing, not fresh. He was 6. He didn't flinch when I touched them, which somehow scared me more than if he had. He just said, "That's from before," in the flat, practiced voice of a kid who'd learned a long time ago that some questions go easier if you answer them before anyone finishes asking. Before what? I wanted to say. I didn't. I toweled him off, got him into pajamas with cartoon dinosaurs on the sleeves, and sat on the edge of the tub for a long minute after he'd padded off to find his siblings, my hands not quite steady on the cold porcelain. I'd had the 3 of them for 9 days by then. My sister Wendy had dropped them at my door with 3 duffel bags, a booster seat, and a note taped to the diaper bag that I still hadn't managed to take down off my refrigerator because some petty wounded part of me wanted to keep looking at it. "You wanted a family so badly, here you go." 11 words, and she'd driven off before I'd even finished reading them. I didn't know it yet, kneeling on my bathroom tile with my sons, my nephews, damp towel still in my hands, but that bruise was going to be the first entry in a notebook that would eventually run 43 pages long. I didn't know yet that it was old, not new. I didn't know that the person in my house who could tell me exactly how old and exactly why was going to spend the next 5 weeks making sure I never asked him directly. I'd wanted kids for 11 years by the time Wendy's showed up on my doorstep, which is a detail I feel strange admitting out loud because of how it looks next to what happened, like the story needs me to have wanted it that badly to make the ending land. But it's true regardless of how it looks. 4 rounds of IVF, 2 miscarriages, a diagnosis with a name I'd stopped saying out loud years ago because saying it made people's faces do a specific pitying thing I couldn't stand. My husband Nate and I had stopped trying the year before, quietly without ever officially deciding to stop, just a slow tapering off of appointments until one day neither of us brought it up anymore. Wendy had used that against me more than once. Not cruelly, exactly, she'd have said if you'd asked her that she was just being honest. But there'd been a specific comment at our mother's 70th birthday, something about how I got to keep my whole life while she was drowning, that had landed with a precision I didn't think was accidental. We weren't close. We'd never really been close, not since we were kids ourselves, but we managed a kind of surface civility that mostly held holidays and the occasional birthday call, both of us too tired to dig at the real thing underneath it. I worked as a court reporter for the county, 14 years transcribing testimony verbatim, trained into a specific kind of exactness that didn't turn off just because I clocked out. Nate taught high school chemistry. We had a small orderly life, a coffee maker on a timer, a cat named Gavel, who slept exclusively on Nate's side of the bed, a junk drawer we both pretended not to know was a junk drawer. None of it had prepared me for 3 kids and a taped note and a 6-week silence that started that same afternoon and didn't break once. Wendy and I had grown up 2 years apart in a house where our mother kept a tally, whether she meant to or not, of who needed rescuing more. I remembered being 11, watching my mother miss my own school play because Wendy, 13 and furious about something long forgotten, had locked herself in the bathroom and needed handling. I'd played my one line to an audience that didn't include either parent, and afterward nobody had asked how it went. It wasn't cruelty, exactly, the way our mother raised us, just a habit of attention that always bent toward whichever daughter was currently on fire. And Wendy, for most of our childhood, had been reliably, dependably on fire. I'd learned early that the safest place to stand in that house was quiet and self-sufficient, which was its own kind of training for what came later, though I didn't see the shape of that until years afterward. Desmond was 14, tall for his age, quiet in a watchful way that I initially read as shyness. Nadia was 10, sharp-tongued and fiercely protective of her little brother. Emmett was 6, and for the first 3 days he asked, every night at bedtime, when his mom was coming back. On the 4th night, he stopped asking. I told myself that was a good sign, that he was settling in. I didn't yet understand it was the opposite. Kids stop asking a question once they've learned, from experience, that the answer is never going to satisfy them. Wendy had told me, the day she dropped them off, that it was just a trip, a working vacation, she'd said, something to do with a job opportunity out of state that needed her full attention for a few weeks. I told myself that was plausible. Wendy had always run a little chaotic, a little last minute, and a sudden work trip wasn't outside the range of things I'd have believed from her a year earlier. 3 days in, I started the notebook, a plain spiral one Nadia and I bought together at the drugstore while getting supplies for Emmett's bruise, which by then had started to worry me enough that I wanted a record of what I was seeing, even if I couldn't yet say why. I wrote down what he ate, what he said, what time he woke up crying. I told myself I was just being careful, the way you're careful with any borrowed thing you don't want to be blamed for damaging. That was rationalization number 1, and it lasted exactly as long as it took the second bruise to show up, this one on Nadia, low on her ribs, the kind you only find if a kid is changing in front of you and forgets to angle away in time. By the end of the first week, my sister still hadn't called, not once. I'd absorbed the cost of it without much thought. Diapers, a booster seat that didn't fit our car, 3 extra place settings settings, the unpaid leave I'd requested from work with a vague explanation about a family emergency that felt both true and not true enough. My supervisor, a patient woman named Colette who'd worked alongside me for a decade, hadn't asked many questions. I hadn't offered many answers. That was rationalization number 2. If I didn't say it out loud, it wasn't really as serious as it felt at 2 in the morning, lying awake listening for footsteps down the hall. I tried calling her myself more than once. The first few times it rang through to voicemail, her outgoing message chirpy and unchanged, like nothing about her life had shifted at all. By the second week, I was calling every other day, then daily, texting things like, "Just let me know you're okay," and "The kids are fine, I just need to hear from you," into a silence that never once texted back so much as a thumbs up. I called her best friend from high school, a woman named Odette, who told me carefully that she hadn't heard from Wendy either, and that this wasn't entirely out of character, which was somehow worse than if it had been. I drove past Wendy's apartment complex once, on a Sunday, telling myself it was on the way to somewhere else. Her car wasn't in the lot. Nobody answered the door. I stood on her welcome mat for a full minute anyway, listening to nothing, before I got back in my car and drove home to 3 kids who were, by then, already calling my kitchen the kitchen instead of your kitchen. The kids flinched at raised voices. All 3 of them, in slightly different ways. Emmett went very still, Nadia's jaw would tighten, Desmond would simply, quietly, place himself between whoever was upset and whichever sibling was smallest in the room. Nate dropped a pan on the stove one night, an ordinary loud clatter, and all 3 kids froze mid-motion like something in the house had gone dangerous. Nobody said anything about it afterward. I wrote it down anyway, dated, the way I'd learned to date everything in the transcript booth. Day 6, 6:40 p.m., pan drop, kids froze, no one spoke. Desmond moved toward Emmett first. Rationalization number 3, kids get startled by loud noises. That's not evidence of anything. That's just childhood. None of them ever asked about their mother after that 4th night. Not once, in 5.5 more weeks. I told myself, again, that it was them adjusting well, grace under pressure. I believed it because believing anything else meant looking directly at something I wasn't ready to look at yet. The pediatrician's office called it in for me before I'd let myself say the word out loud. I'd taken all 3 kids in for a routine well check 2.5 weeks into the 6th, mostly because Emmett had a cough that wouldn't quit, and Dr. Anitha Rao, 19 years in practice, half glasses pushed up into gray hair, a manner so calm it made everything she said land harder, asked to speak with me alone after she'd finished with Emmett. She had her laptop turned so I could see it, 3 sets of notes open in separate tabs, and she went through them methodically, the way I imagined she'd learned to after 19 years of conversations exactly like this one. "The bruising on his arm is healing, not fresh," she said, "and I want to be straightforward with you, because I think you already suspect what I'm about to say. That pattern, 4 small marks, evenly spaced, isn't consistent with rough play. It's consistent with a hand gripping a small arm harder than a small arm should be gripped." I also noted a similar pattern, older, on Nadia's ribs, and Desmond has what looks like a healed rope burn on his wrist that he told me was from helping carry something. Individually, any one of these could have an innocent explanation. Together, across all 3 children, in a similar age range and healing stage, I'd be doing you a disservice not to flag it. She turned the laptop back toward herself and typed something brief. "I'd like your permission to document all 3, photograph what's still visible, and file a report through the state's mandatory reporting line. Not to accuse anyone specifically, I don't have enough to know who or exactly when, but because a pattern like this needs to be on record somewhere other than your spiral notebook." I asked her, my voice smaller than I meant it to be, what happened after a report like that got filed. She told me gently that in most cases like this, where a child was already in a safe, documented living situation, the report simply created an official record and often a referral to exactly the kind of caseworker conversation I was already unknowingly about to have. "It's not a lightning bolt," she said. "It's a paper trail. Paper trails matter enormously later, even when nothing happens immediately." I remember my stomach dropping, that specific hollow lurch, standing in a pediatric exam room with a laminated growth chart on the wall behind her, and a paper gown crinkling under my hand. I asked her what more than a few weeks meant. She told me gently that some of what she was seeing predated my sister's trip by what looked like months, possibly longer. I drove home with all 3 kids buckled in the back seat, my hands tight on the wheel, replaying 9 months, a year, of holiday visits where I hadn't looked closely enough, hadn't asked the right questions, had let "we're fine, just busy" answer for everything. I called my old college roommate Greta Sundstrom that same night, 12 years by then with the county's Child Protective Services division, though I'd never once, in all our years of friendship, actually needed to use that particular fact about her. She came over the next evening off the clock, sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea she didn't drink, and listened to the whole thing in order. The note, the 6 weeks of silence, the bruises, Dr. Rao's report, the notebook. "What you're describing," Greta said carefully, "sounds less like an isolated bad 6 weeks and more like a pattern that this trip just happened to expose. I can't open a formal investigation off a friend-to-friend conversation. That has to come through proper channels, and it will. I'll make sure of that tomorrow. But informally, as someone who's seen 100 versions of this, the parent who suddenly disappears usually isn't the whole story. Sometimes she's the danger. Sometimes she's running from one. Sometimes both are true at once, and the kids are caught holding all of it because nobody's asked them directly what they've actually been living with." She helped me start start the paperwork for emergency temporary guardianship that week. Not to take anything permanently, she was careful to say, but to create a legal container sturdy enough to hold the kids safely while the actual picture came into focus. She walked me through what a formal report would trigger on her end: an intake number, an assigned investigator, a home visit within 72 hours as standard protocol, even though she'd already, informally, seen the home in question a dozen times over the years. I have to recuse myself from the actual case file, she told me, because you're my friend, and that's a conflict. But I can point you at the right door and make sure you don't have to find it blind. She connected me with Inez Calloway, a family law attorney 15 years into a practice built almost entirely around guardianship and custody cases, who filed an ex parte emergency petition on a Thursday afternoon with Dr. Rao's documentation and my notebook, by then 26 pages deep, attached as supporting exhibits, labeled, Inez told me almost apologetically, Exhibit A through Exhibit F, because the court liked things labeled even when the underlying facts were anything but tidy. Courts move slowly on almost everything except genuine emergencies, Inez told me over the phone, her voice brisk, unhurried in the specific way of someone who'd said this exact sentence 100 times before. What you have here, a documented pattern of injury predating an unexplained 6-week disappearance, corroborated by a treating physician, plus a mandatory reporter's filing already in the system. That's the kind of thing that gets a judge's attention fast. I've requested an emergency hearing. Judge Corwin Vance has the family docket this cycle. 21 years on the bench. He doesn't rattle easily, and he doesn't like being played, which in a case like this works in your favor. I asked her, more than once that week, whether I was doing the wrong thing, whether I was overreacting to bruises that might have an explanation I simply hadn't heard yet. She told me evenly that the paperwork wasn't an accusation, it was a container. If Wendy came back with a reasonable explanation for everything, the container would simply dissolve, no harm done. If she didn't, the container would already be in place to catch what fell through. Wendy came back on a Saturday, unannounced, 40 days after she'd left, pulling into my driveway in a car I didn't recognize, wearing sunglasses despite the overcast sky, and walking up my front path like she'd been gone an afternoon instead of 6 weeks. She didn't knock. She opened the door. She still had a key, I realized, one I should have thought to ask back, and called out for the kids in a bright, performative voice that made something in my chest go very cold. "Mama's home," she said, arms already open, and I watched, from the kitchen doorway, all 3 kids freeze in the living room exactly the way they'd frozen at the sound of a dropped pan. Nobody moved toward her. Emmett's hand found Nadia's sleeve and stayed there. Desmond stood up slowly from the couch, setting the remote down with a care that felt deliberate, like he was buying himself a few extra seconds to decide something. My neighbor Priscilla was out front watering her hydrangeas, which meant Wendy had an audience by the time I made it to the door myself, and she used it, her voice pitching louder, more wounded, more public than it needed to be for a conversation happening on my own porch. "I can't believe you," she said, loud enough for the whole street. "I go through the hardest 6 weeks of my life, and I come home to find out my own sister's been keeping my kids from me, filing paperwork behind my back? I'm their mother, Corinne." I told her as calmly as I could manage, with my hands shaking at my sides, that nobody had kept anything from her. She was the one who'd left, who hadn't called once in 6 weeks, who'd left 3 kids with unexplained injuries and a note that read like a parting shot instead of a request for help. She talked over me. She always had. Her voice climbed further, hitting the particular pitch she used to use on our mother, half fury and half performance, aimed as much at the street as at me. She said I didn't understand what it meant to be a mother, that I'd never had to make the kind of impossible choices she'd had to make, that some people got to sit safely on the sidelines of parenthood, judging women who actually had to live inside it. I felt the old shape of that argument settle over me, the specific familiar weight of it, and for one long moment I understood exactly how easy it would be to let it work on me the way it always had, to fold, to apologize, to hand 3 kids worth of belongings back into a car and call it family loyalty instead of what it actually was. Then Desmond stepped between us. He didn't say it loudly. That was the thing I remember most, how quiet his voice was, how still he held himself, 14 years old, and standing in the gap between his mother and his aunt, like he'd rehearsed the position 100 times without ever expecting to actually need it. "Are you going to tell her?" he said, looking at his mother. "Or should I?" The street went silent in a way that had nothing to do with volume. Wendy's face did something complicated, fury and fear moving across it almost simultaneously, and she told him in a voice gone suddenly brittle that this wasn't the time, that he needed to go inside. He didn't move. "I've been signing your name on the school forms for over a year," he said, still looking at her, not at me. "Since I was 13. Every time you didn't come home for a few days, I forged your signature so the school wouldn't call anyone. I told the front office you had a work schedule that made pickup hard. I told Nadia's teacher the same thing. I've been doing the grocery shopping with the emergency card since last spring. I know how to make it look normal. I've been making it look normal for over a year, so nobody would take us away from you." His voice cracked just slightly on the last word. "I'm not doing it anymore. I can't. Emmett has bruises he won't explain, and I don't actually know who put them there, because there were men who came around sometimes when you weren't home, and I never let them near him if I could help it, but I couldn't always be there, and I'm 14, and I don't want to be the one holding this by myself anymore." Wendy didn't say anything for a long moment. Behind her, I watched Nadia's hand find Emmett's, both of them very still on the porch steps, the way kids get still when the ground under a conversation attention shifts, and they're waiting to find out whether it's going to hold. "You forged my signature," Wendy finally said, and it wasn't the sentence I expected. Not, "Is that true?" Not, "Who are these men?" Just that, flat and stunned, like the smallest, most containable piece of what he'd said was the only one she could let herself hear first. "Because you weren't there to sign it yourself," Desmond said. "You haven't been there for a long time, Mom. This trip wasn't different. It was just longer." Wendy sat down on my porch steps then, right there in front of Priscilla and her hydrangeas, and put her face in her hands, and I stood there for a long moment, not knowing whether to comfort her or call Greta or simply stand very still and let the three of them have whatever this was. What came out of her, in pieces, over the next hour, first on the porch, then at my kitchen table once I'd gotten Priscilla to go back inside her own house and the kids settled with a movie they weren't really watching, was a version of the 6 weeks I hadn't imagined. A landlord, Garrett Kessler, who'd been threatening eviction and, according to Wendy, worse, over back rent she couldn't pay. A court summons for a debt collection case she'd been dodging for months. A genuine, if badly executed, belief that disappearing was the only way to keep the kids clear of a legal mess that could have swallowed all 4 of them. He kept saying he had people who could make things disappear faster than the courts could, Wendy said, both hands wrapped around a mug of tea she hadn't touched, staring at some point on my kitchen table that wasn't quite the table. I didn't know if that meant the debt or meant us. I still don't, honestly. I owed him almost $11,000 by the end. Rent, late fees he kept adding, some he probably invented outright. I couldn't pay it, and I couldn't fight it, and I panicked. I told myself if I could just get far enough away for long enough, it would either resolve itself or I'd find a way to fix it before anyone noticed how bad it had actually gotten. She hadn't called, she said, because every day she didn't call felt like one more day she could pretend the 6 weeks hadn't actually cost anything. That if she never confirmed what was happening at my house, some part of her could keep believing nothing was happening at all. The men Desmond mentioned, she admitted, her voice dropping to something almost inaudible, were connected to the debt. People Kessler had sent more than once before she'd fled the apartment entirely. Men who'd shown up at odd hours, who'd stood too close to the door, who'd once grabbed Desmond by the arm hard enough to leave a mark when he'd tried to keep one of them from coming further inside. "That's the wrist," I said quietly, and she nodded, not looking up. She hadn't known, she said, hadn't let herself know, how much of that Desmond had been managing alone even before this trip. The forged signatures, the grocery runs, the specific choreography of making a chaotic house look from the outside like an ordinary one. She'd told herself he was resilient. She hadn't let herself use the more accurate word, and when I asked her gently what the more accurate word was, she was quiet for a long time before she said it. Parentified. She'd read it once, she admitted, in an article she'd clicked past without finishing, because finishing it would have meant admitting what she was looking at. It wasn't an excuse for the note on the diaper bag. It wasn't an excuse for 6 weeks of silence, or for however many months before that. She hadn't been fully present enough to notice her own son forging her name. But it was, finally, the truth, instead of a performance of grief for an audience of one hydrangea-watering neighbor. And something in the room shifted once it was actually said out loud instead of hidden. Nate found me in the laundry room an hour after Wendy left that night, sitting on an overturned basket with my knees pulled up, not really crying, just sitting very still the way I imagined the kids had learned to. He didn't say anything at first. He sat down on the dryer across from me and waited, which was, I'd learned over 11 years of marriage, his particular way of holding space for something too big to talk about right away. "He's 14, I finally said. "He's been doing all of it for a year. The forms, the groceries, all of it. And none of us knew because he's good at it. He's so good at it, Nate, and that's the part I can't get past. A kid shouldn't be that good at making a bad situation look fine." Nate didn't try to fix it, which was its own kind of gift. He just said that we weren't going to let him keep being good at it, that whatever came next, legally, formally, the actual job now was making sure Desmond got to be bad at things again, the way 14-year-olds are supposed to be bad at things, forgetting homework and losing shoes and not having a single system for managing an emergency, because there wasn't supposed to be one for him to manage. I called Greta again that night, past 10, and she picked up on the second ring like she'd been expecting it. I told her everything Wendy had said, the debt, Kessler, the men at the door, the word parentified, that Wendy herself had finally used. Greta was quiet for a moment before she told me that what I was describing added an entirely new dimension to the filing. Not just neglect and isolation, but a child effectively functioning as a parent for a period well before the 6-week disappearance, which the court would likely weigh heavily in determining not just the emergency order, but any longer-term plan. "This is exactly the kind of detail that changes how seriously a judge takes the whole picture," she said. "Get it to Inez first thing tomorrow." The hearing in front of Judge Vance happened 11 days later, delayed slightly by a scheduling conflict that felt, at the time, unbearably long to wait through. Inez walked me through what to expect beforehand, that Judge Vance would want to hear directly from Dr. I. Rao's written findings from Greta's preliminary assessment, and carefully, in a closed chambers conversation with a court-appointed child advocate present, from Desmond himself, whose statement about the forged signatures turned out to matter more to the judge than almost anything else in the file. The courtroom itself was smaller than I expected, wood-paneled, a flag in the corner slightly crooked on its stand. Wendy sat across the aisle with her own attorney, a tired-looking man who spent most of the hearing writing notes he never seemed to reference. I sat beside Inez in a suit I'd bought 2 days earlier, because everything I owned suddenly felt like it wasn't formal enough for what was happening. Dr. Rao testified for 11 minutes, calm and specific, walking Judge Vance through the same clinical language she'd used with me weeks earlier: healing stages, patterns, mandatory reporting protocol, without once raising her voice or reaching for drama she didn't need. Greta's written assessment was entered as an exhibit, rather than read aloud, at Inez's request, to keep the focus on the medical and the documented, rather than on secondhand impressions. A 14-year-old covering for a parent's absence for over a year isn't just evidence of what happened, Judge Vance said from the bench, reading from notes in a voice that had clearly delivered thousands of rulings and had lost none of its weight for the repetition. It's evidence of a child who's been carrying an adult's responsibilities for longer than any child should. That, more than the 6-week trip itself, is what concerns this court. He looked briefly toward Wendy, not unkindly. I want to be clear that nothing in this order is a permanent judgment on you as a parent. It's a judgment on what this court is willing to risk while the full picture gets sorted out. And right now, that answer is not much. He granted a temporary guardianship order that afternoon. Not permanent, not adversarial in the way Wendy had first accused me of wanting, but conditional and specific. The kids would live primarily with Nate and me while Wendy completed a structured support program addressing housing instability and the debt situation with Kessler, whose collection practices, it turned out once Inez started asking pointed questions, were themselves the subject of a separate consumer protection complaint that a tenants' rights attorney was now pursuing independently. Supervised visitation, twice weekly, with room to expand as things stabilized. A follow-up review in 90 days. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't quite. 3 days after the hearing, the middle school called. Not about Emmett or Nadia, but about Desmond, whose year of forged signatures had apparently also covered 3 unexcused absences the school hadn't caught in real time, and which now, flagged in the district's records the same week his name appeared in a guardianship filing, triggered a truancy review meeting neither Inez nor I had anticipated. It took another week of phone calls, a letter from Dr. Rao, and a frank conversation between Inez and the district's attendance officer to get the record corrected instead of escalated. A reminder, as Inez put it dryly, that even a good outcome in one system doesn't automatically clear the ones running quietly alongside it. Desmond sat through the meeting himself at his own insistence and told the attendance officer almost exactly what he'd told his mother on my porch, without flinching, like he'd already used up whatever it cost him to say it the first time. Wendy calls now, most weeks, sometimes twice. Her voice on the phone is different than it used to be. Less performance in it, more of the ordinary tiredness of someone doing the actual work instead of narrating around it. She's 6 months into the program Judge Vance ordered. She hasn't missed a visitation yet. The apartment she's in now is smaller than her old one and nowhere near Garrett Kessler's properties, and she's told me twice, unprompted, that she likes it better anyway, which I choose to believe is true and not just something she's decided to say. Nadia's stopped flinching at raised voices entirely, mostly, though a slammed car door somewhere on the street will still catch her for half a second before she catches herself catching it. She started asking lately whether she can go back to gymnastics, a thing she apparently used to do before I knew to ask about it. And Nate spent a Saturday finding a studio with an opening in her age group, like it was the most urgent errand of his week. Desmond still flinches less than he used to, but not all the way to nothing. He sleeps in on Saturdays now, the way a 14-year-old is supposed to, instead of getting up early out of habit to check on everyone else first. A few weeks ago, I found him at my kitchen table before school, eating cereal, not filling out a single form, not covering for anyone, just a kid running late for the bus like any other kid in the world. Dr. Rao says the wrist has healed clean. I don't think the other thing heals quite the same way, but I watch him laugh at something Emmett says, unguarded, more often than I used to, and I let that be enough for now. I still have the note. I never did take it down off the refrigerator. Some mornings I catch myself reading it again while the coffee maker finishes its cycle. You wanted a family so badly, here you go. And I think about how true it turned out to be, in a way Wendy never meant it, and in a way I wouldn't trade back now even if I could.